What I'm going to do is talk about the way in which, and to follow on from Peter's work, to comment on the way in which international law is operating, particularly in the light of the case brought by South Africa against Israel to the International Court of Justice. And I will begin with a very simple story from South Africa. After the massacre of October the 7th, understandably, the chair of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, Karen Miller, wrote to the African National Congress asking for a meeting to discuss the South African government's policy. The ANC, of course, was then the sole ruling party of the country. On October the 17th, notice the date, there is a reply from the first Deputy Secretary General of the ANC, Mr. Mokonyane, who says, of course, we recognize the brutal attacks of October the 7th, but we also notice the genocidal and atrocious response by Israel. So, within 10 days of the October the 7th attacks, the African National Congress had already determined that the response to those attacks was genocidal. And that, of course, explains why the case brought by South Africa arrived so quickly at the International Court of Justice, because it was heard in January 2025. And by the way, the ICJ is extremely slow in its operation. So this was a very rapid development. And it means that the South African government had been preparing this probably even before October the 7th. So what we have is a framework in which the South African government operates now legally in the court. Now, what's interesting about the court case, of course, is that the South African government has to some extent lost interest in it, because the most important thing was naming the genocide, was making the accusation. It is not actually proving the accusation in court, because the South African side have now agreed that they can postpone until July 2029 the written stages of the exchanges of submissions between the two parties. That means that the court obviously will not come to a decision until sometime long after 2029. Now that's interesting, because in a short opinion piece in Opinionio Juris, an associate professor of international law in Britain, Jane Rooney, writes an article in which she says, we don't need to wait for the International Court of Justice to act on the genocide that is taking place in Gaza. Why? We have the determination by the independent commission of inquiry into the occupied Palestinian territories, including East Jerusalem and Israel, the snappy title, a commission set up in 2021 by the Human Rights Council, itself not a body of the United Nations, but an intergovernmental organization under the United Nations. It's not a principal organ, it can't make decisions. And this commission, chaired by Judge Navi Pillay, produces a 77-page report which says that they have found that genocide has been committed in Gaza. As a consequence, Professor Rooney says, we don't need to wait for the International Court of Justice. Indeed, this report will shape the decision of the International Court of Justice, but we need to act now to prevent the genocide. She was writing, by the way, as a in the consequence of the. Thank you. She was writing in the context of the ceasefire which the Trump administration had negotiated. And what she said was that the ceasefire was an example of slow genocide. So that whether there is a war in which the South African National Congress say it is genocidal and atrocious, or whether the war has ceased, Professor Rooney says it's a slow genocide anyway. So genocide is taking place irrespective of what is actually taking place. And of course, the commissioned report, which she refers to, is itself an interesting document. 77 pages, quite short. But 495 footnotes, which looked like very, very serious research, you see, on such a small document. But when you actually look at all those footnotes, a third of them refer to previous reports of the same commission. I looked up one particular thing. It alleges that, this has become a part of a new report that the commission has subsequently produced. The allegation that the IDF in Gaza have been targeting children. There's a new report which says now there's genocide against children in Gaza. And I go to the section which is talking about this, and they say there are snipers. There's no discussion of snipers, what a sniper is. And that the Israeli forces are targeting children. I look at the footnote. The footnote is to a previous report which says just the Israeli armed forces are targeting children. That is the footnote. That is the footnote. So in other words, their own assertions are what is the basis of their findings. And it is a disgrace because Navi Pillay, by the way, the South African former judge of the International Criminal Court and a leading judge on the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, had sat and wrote the judgment on one of the most important cases on genocide, the Akezu case. And this judge seems to forget her law when she is the chairperson of a commission of inquiry into Israel and the Palestinian occupied territories. And when you look at this report, and by the way, Jane Rooney thinks that immediately on the basis of this report, the United Nations General Assembly should impose sanctions and on Israel and all sorts of other prohibitions to isolate Israel, to prevent the genocide. If you read the report, it is based, as is the South African submission to the International Court of Justice, on 3 statements of Israeli politicians. President Herzog, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and former Defense Minister Gallant. None of these statements, by the way, are made in the terms of orders or instructions. None of them. They are in press briefings. They are in short discussions, as far as Gallant is concerned, with a small number of troops. They are, as far as Netanyahu is concerned, it is talking actually on the day, the afternoon of the events themselves. And just to give one example, President Herzog, in this press briefing, notice as the press briefing, says, there are no innocent people in Gaza. And he's saying this in days after it has become evident that not only were Hamas and Islamic Jihad involved in October the 7th, but a significant section of the attackers were actually civilians from Gaza. Now, whether those choice of words are correct or not is another matter, and it's an analysis. But it's not an order. He then says, in the same statement that he's making, that of course Israel will abide by international law, and there are no excuses for killing innocent civilians at all in any circumstances whatsoever. Pillay, the great expert on genocide in the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, says it's not direct incitement, it's indirect incitement. But if you look at the cases on the question of genocide, you can't have indirect incitement. If you have incitement to genocide, it is the only inference you can make. It is a call for genocide, the only call. And of course, what is quite evident throughout the Commission's report is that while they mention Hamas, they never mention that Hamas is fighting. So all you have is a one-sided account of a conflict in which Israel appears to be actively engaged in armed struggle, but there is no commentary on what is taking place by the opponents, nor is there any commentary on the way in which the opponents are fighting this war. We can have many criticisms of the way in which the IDF and the Israeli government have conducted themselves in Gaza, of course. That is also, by the way, made by the leadership, many people in the higher echelons of the IDF. But you do have to comment on the way in which Hamas fought the war and still fights the war, as a matter of fact, which is, of course, announcing it as a resistance movement, and therefore it is not bound by the laws and customs of war. This, of course, is rubbish because a protocol to the Geneva Conventions makes quite clear that armed groups that are not part of the state are covered by the Geneva Conventions. We know they fight within civilian areas. They fight using hospitals, schools, mosques as military installations. And I know full well that Palestinians have frequently used medical facilities for all sorts of purposes during armed conflicts. Just one small story: when I was teaching at Birzeit University, some students, during the Second Intifada, some students from Nablus wanted to visit me. So they hire an ambulance. They are dressed up as if they have been in an accident or something, and for $300 only, this of course is quite a long time ago, for $300 only can travel from Nablus to Ramallah in order to see their professor. So I know full well that medical facilities are often used for purposes which are not medical. And I'm very well aware that hospitals in Gaza were obviously used by those hostage takers. They were used by military commanders. And of course, because of the tunnel system, it was very difficult for the IDF or for any military force to distinguish between civilians and combatants, between protected buildings, which you are obliged to under the Geneva Conventions. Now, this poses a problem of how we therefore deal with the question of the allegations against Israel. And of course, the obvious example is something which is quite recent, which was the fight against Islamic State. Between 2014 and 2017, if you remember, there was a major international effort to suppress and to get rid of the Islamic State organization, which had seized, in the matter of a few months, whole swathes of Syria and Iraq, from Raqqa to Mosul, had about 10 million people under their control. And the IS group had a very, or ISIL, or Daesh, depending how you look at it, had a very clear policy, rather like that of Hamas, which is that they would fight in civilian areas. They would use protected buildings. They would ignore the laws and customs of war. And that posed a very big problem for the forces who were fighting against them. But the United Nations Security Council, unlike in response to October the 7th, adopted Resolution 2249 in 2015, which said that ISIS represented an unprecedented threat to international peace and security, and called on states to take all actions possible to suppress it, which they did. American forces, British forces, French forces, Russian forces in Syria, and of course the Kurdish forces on the ground and some of the Iraqi forces on the ground cooperated in this. And the destruction of the places where Islamic State were in control was extraordinary. Hospitals were raided. If you read, for instance, the account by David French, now a journalist for the New York Times, who was a legal officer during this period in Iraq, he talks about raiding hospitals and how you have to do it in order to suppress what was an unprecedented threat to international peace and security. And what's extraordinary about October the 7th, of course, is that you have that amazing statement from Ghazi Hamad, the Politburo member of Hamas, on Lebanese television on the 24th of October 2023, where he says plainly on television, October the 7th is just the beginning. There will be more October the 7th until Israel is annihilated. It's strange that the independent commission which I referred to quote this and then in a later part of the document say it is completely unfounded that Israel faced any existential threat. But they quoted it. I have to finish, but of course there's many more things I would want to say. But what I do want to say is this. The point that Peter is making about the remolding of international law and the international human rights movement is extremely important. And what I think we have to notice is something else, that the human rights movement is perhaps playing a bigger role in this than the international legal structures. And what I get from this is that making the accusation of genocide or apartheid are the most important things. Because once you've made those two accusations, particularly against the Jewish state, it is obvious that the Jewish state is more evil, more dangerous, more violent than any other state which exists, and therefore it becomes, to the international public, and to large sections of the international public, an established fact. And I have to say, as someone who marks examination papers from all over the world, every summer I read precisely this analysis, that Israel is not only committing genocide, but is a colonial settler state, is committing apartheid, is committing the crime of apartheid, and therefore is particularly evil, and unless it is dealt with, we will not have international peace and security. Thank you for your attention.